Okay, we're making some good progress here. We've got a long way to go, and I hope to cover some ground here in this next installment. What we're going to talk about today, guys, is social expectations in a racist society. And you'll see what I mean here in a second, but more or less, I'm talking about expectations that are coming from the white community insofar as their interactions with people of color. If you joined us the last time, I was talking about Richard Wright becoming aware of race, what we called racial consciousness. It wasn't something that he was essentially aware of before some of these incidents, some of them very, very vivid, right? Two lines at a train station. The murder of one of his friends for having a relationship with a white girl. But ultimately, he becomes conscious of race, and he becomes conscious that race is way more complicated, no pun intended, than a black and white matter. And so he begins to understand that there's a set of rules that he needs to learn and abide by. And he also begins to understand that ignorance is not a pass. You can't just claim, well, I didn't know that I shouldn't do that, because that wasn't a good enough excuse, okay? Today, what I want to talk about, another really important part of this system of white supremacy would be expectations that are coming out of the white community, right? Expectations in terms of not only how racial minorities interacted with them, but also what these people, these racial minorities, ought to aspire to, ought not to aspire to. Before we get going, though, right, I want to slow things down and talk a little bit about these expectations. The concept of white supremacy essentially guaranteed white people that they would occupy a place that was socially, politically, economically, even culturally superior than people of color. In this racist society, the expectation was that white people would be given deferential treatment. You could say something as ridiculous as the earth is flat. And the racial minority that's on the other side of this equation, looking back at you, is expected to take that as serious as daylight, right? That to push back, let alone mock or ridicule, could have pretty severe consequences. And you'll see what I mean here in the context of Richard Wright in a second, okay? Before we go any further, let's make a quick connection to class, an early connection to class, and go way back to the beginning of the semester and talk about, revisit that issue of the equality of opportunity, because this is an expectation as well. I told you at the time that the reason that so many people, so many Americans went along with this idea of laissez-faire capitalism and, the non-regulation of big business was because we believed in this concept of the equality of opportunity. That on paper, right, I might be dirt poor and you might be filthy rich, but on paper we're equal and we have an equal opportunity to rise as high as our talents would take us, okay? If you're good enough, smart enough, you got good enough habits, so on and so forth, nothing's going to stop you. And I also told you that this was hollow in the sense that it was a segmented society. It was segmented along race and along sex, okay? So yeah, the equality of opportunity may have existed. It may have been paper thin, right? But it may have existed, but you had to be two things. One, you had to be white, and two, you had to be a man. If you were a woman or a racial minority, the equality of opportunity just simply didn't apply to you. And the expectation, or really, you might even say the assumption, was you would set your sights much, much lower. You'll see what I'm talking about here because there are lots and lots of opportunities to investigate this concept in Richard Wright, beginning with chapter 6 of the book. Now, if you're using the online version that's provided for you, go to page 136. Page 136. It doesn't really matter what book you're using because it's the very first line of chapter 6, starting out with the next day at school. Find that. The beginning of chapter 6, page 136. The next day at school, I inquired among the students about jobs and was given the name of a white family that wanted a boy to do chores. If you're at this point in the book, you know that money's a big deal for him, and he tries to do any job that he can to help his family out. They're always short on money, and many nights he goes hungry. He goes on. That afternoon, as soon as school let out, I went to the address. A tall, dour, white woman talked to me. Yes, she needed a boy, an honest boy, $2 a week, mornings, evenings, and all day Saturdays. Washing dishes, chopping wood, scrubbing floors, cleaning the yard. I would get my breakfast and dinner. As I asked timid questions, my eyes darted about. What kind of food would I get? Was the place as shabby as the kitchen indicated? Do you want this job? The woman asked. Yes, ma'am, I said, afraid to trust my own judgment. Now, boy, I want to ask you a question and I want you to tell me the truth, she said. Yes, ma'am, I said, all attention. Do you steal? She asked me, seriously. I burst into a laugh. Then I checked myself. What's so damn funny about that? She asked. Lady, if I was a thief, I'd never tell anybody. I mean, think about the ridiculousness of that question. What do you mean? She blazed with red face. I had made a mistake in my first 5 minutes in the white world. I hung my head. I mumbled, no, I don't steal. She stared at me, trying to make up her mind. Let's slow things down. Again, there is absolutely nothing wrong with what he said. It's logical. It makes sense. Why in the world would somebody honestly look back having been asked that question and say, yeah, you take your eye off me for 1 second and I'm going to clean this place out? It's a ridiculous, stupid question, but it was a question that he was expected to stand there and answer honestly. I mean, you'd have thought in her mind, she asked him something as simple as, are you 16 years of age or older? And he was expected to answer truthfully, okay? It's also a relatively humiliating question, right? Yes, I steal, I'm a thief, I'm a terrible person, okay? And so this is the kind of mistreatment and abuse that racial minorities are expected to absorb. It's a part of the white supremacy system, okay? There's more. In this particular instance, there's more. I'm a few paragraphs down now, and it starts out, it's on the next page. The next morning I chopped wood. Find that. The next morning I chopped wood. Beginning of a paragraph. Let's be honest about something. This job is hard, right? There's nothing easy about it. The next morning, I chopped wood for the cook stove, lugged in scuttles of coal for the grates, washed the front porch, and swept the back porch, swept the kitchen, helped wait on the table, and washed the dishes. I was sweating. I swept the front walk and ran to the store to shop. When I returned, the woman said, your breakfast is in the kitchen. Thank you, ma'am. I saw a plate of thick black molasses and a hunk of white bread on the table. Would I get no more than this? They had eggs, bacon, coffee. I picked up the bread and tried to break it. It was stale and hard. Well, I would drink the molasses. I lifted the plate and brought it to my lips, and I saw floating on the surface of the black liquid, green and white bits of mold. God damn, I can't eat this, I told myself. The food wasn't even clean. The woman came into the kitchen as I was putting on my coat. He's packing up to get out of there. You didn't eat, she said. No, ma'am, I said. I'm not hungry. You'll eat at home? She asked, hopefully. Well, I just wasn't hungry this morning, ma'am, I lied. You don't like molasses and bread? She said dramatically. Oh, yes, I do, ma'am, I defended myself quickly, not wanting her to think that I dared criticize what she'd given me. And she goes on to say something to the effect of, I don't know what's happening nowadays, you people, and she doesn't use the term you people. You know, basically you're getting too haughty, okay? There's an expectation there, and that expectation is she can give him any slop that you wouldn't even feed your dog, or your dog would refuse to eat, and he's expected to gobble this up as if it's, you know, a 5-star restaurant, okay? And so the expectation being is that these people aren't good enough for edible food. But woe be to the person that questions it, okay? There's another exchange in this same example that I also think that you can get some mileage out of. It's a few lines down. She's talking about what he wants to be, or asking him what he wants to be. And she asks him, find this in the book, what grade are you? What grade are you in? Find that. She asks him, what grade are you in school? 7th, ma'am. Then why are you going to school? She asked in surprise. Well, I want to be a writer, I mumbled, unsure of myself. I'd not planned to tell her that, but she had made me feel so utterly wrong and of no account that I needed to bolster myself. A what? She demanded. A writer, I mumbled. For what? To write stories, I mumbled defensively. You'll never be a writer. Who on earth put that stupid idea in your head? Again, the expectation is a writer is a person of consequence. To be a writer, you need to be educated. To be educated, you need to be of a certain variety, she doesn't say it, but of race. In her world, it's unthinkable that he could do something like this, that he could be something like that. He needs to set his sights much, much lower. You'll never be anything more than the help. You'll never be anything more than subservient to me. That is the expectation here, okay? Very vivid example of the way that white supremacy works with respect to expectations. But we have a little bit more work to do here. I want you to find the paragraph that starts out, fearing that my family might think. Find that, fearing that my family might think. He still needs to find a job, and he doesn't want his family to think that he's letting them down. So he says, fearing that my family might think I was finicky, I lied to them, telling them that the white woman had already hired a boy. He quits the other job. He just can't take that. At school, I continued to ask about jobs and was directed to another address. And as soon as school was out, I made for the house. Yes, the woman said that she wanted a boy who could milk a cow, feed the chickens, gather vegetables, and help serve breakfast and dinner. But I can't milk a cow, ma'am, I said. Where are you from? She asked incredulously. Here in Jackson, I said. You mean to stand there, she uses a racial slur, and tell me that you live in Jackson and you don't know how to milk a cow? She demanded in surprise. I mean, think of how insulting and how degrading to have to sit there and endure that kind of verbal beratement. I said nothing, but I was quickly learning the reality, a Negro's reality of the white world. One woman had assumed that I would tell her if I stole, and now this woman was amazed that I could not milk a cow, an African American like me, daring to live in Jackson and not knowing how to milk a cow. Very vivid example of the expectations that the white community had for people like Richard Wright. Let's connect this example to the class, and this is going to sound a bit abstract, so stay with me. Remember me talking about the Montgomery Bus boycott? I had mentioned at the time that when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, she was actually right. And I don't just mean like by history, I mean she was sitting in the black section. The expectation was blacks would sit at the back of the bus as a constant reminder that you're a second-class citizen, but she was actually in the back section, but the front row. Busy day on the bus, white man gets on, and the expectation is, you'll give me your seat, right? Demands that she get up, she refuses. Bus driver pulls over the bus, demands that she gets up, she refuses, and she's arrested, and it touches off the Montgomery Bus boycott, and the civil rights movement's beginning to hit its stride. But there were a lot of expectations there. That the expectation was that not only would blacks sit in the back of the bus, but they would be happy sitting in the back of the bus. Not only would she get out of her seat at a drop of a hat's notice, but she would be happy to get out of the seat. And she would, even if she wasn't happy, she would at least be, smart enough to understand that she better get out of her seat, otherwise bad things could happen, like being arrested. And so I think that you can connect those two, any one of those examples that I gave you from Richard Wright, along to something along the lines of the Montgomery Bus boycott. Let's have one more example before we call it a day. Now, this example is going to come to us in chapter 10, and it's going to be several paragraphs into chapter 10. If you're following along online, that would be page 181. It'll go into 182, but find the paragraph that starts out, I had begun coping, right? I had begun coping. He's going to talk about how he just can't you know, accept, he can't bear the thought of having to accept this second class citizenship and, setting his sights so low. He can't endure that for much longer. I had begun coping with the white world too late. I could not make subservient an automatic part of my behavior. I had to feel and think out each tiny item of racial experience in the light of the whole race problem. And to each item, I brought the whole of my life. While standing before a white woman, I had to figure out how to perform each act and how to say each word. I could not help it. I could not grin. Go down a couple paragraphs. I began to marvel at, find that. I began to marvel at how smoothly the black boys acted out the roles that the white race had mapped out for them. Most of them were not conscious of living a special, separate, stunted way of life. Yet I knew that in some period of their growing up, a period that they had no doubt forgotten, there had to be developed in them a delicate, sensitive, controlling mechanism that shut off their minds and emotions from all that the white race had said was taboo. Although they lived in America, where in theory there existed the equality of opportunity, they knew unerringly what to aspire to and what not to aspire to. It gets back to what he was talking about with respect to, you want to be a writer? There's no way you'll ever be a writer. There's another example that I think that you could use in here. The degrading treatment that one of his co-workers suffers, actually walks into. He's the elevator operator, and this guy will literally allow a white man to kick him in exchange for a few quarters. And, Richard Wright was just, to say amazed is probably not the right word. He's floored, he's appalled, he's horrified that some other human being would allow themselves to be degraded as such, but this was the expectation. And this particular elevator operator, who had, in Richard Wright's mind long ago given up on any sort of higher ambition, but, this elevator operator is almost playing the white community, kind of indulging their expectations that they could abuse, that they could degrade. In this case, they could physically assault them with complete immunity. There would be zero consequences, okay? Let's take the opportunity to connect this last example to the class. And this is going to be a deep cut, okay? I'm going to take you back to the 1930s, and, this is going to coincide with the time period that he's writing. Franklin Roosevelt, when he ushered in the New Deal, he also ushered in a far more diverse cabinet. I told you about Frances Perkins, the first ever female to be appointed to a presidential secretary position. She's the Secretary of Labor. Another woman that I was telling you about in that same lecture was an African-American woman by the name of Mary McLeod Bethune. And McLeod Bethune was appointed to this presidential post, big, important job. She's a black lady in Washington, which at the time was very much a southern town. She's walking into the White House one day, and one of the groundskeeper, he's a laborer, a more or less a janitor for the grounds. Nothing wrong with that, but we're not exactly talking about the Secretary of State either. He stops her and he says, "Hey, wait a minute, Auntie. Now understand something. Number one, to refer to a woman as auntie by a white man, that was the equivalent of referring to an African-American man as boy. It was a thumb in the eye. It was a form of disrespect and a reminder that you're a second-class citizen. But it got deeper. So where do you think you're going? As she's heading into the White House, one of the most important buildings in the world, certainly the country. Her reaction is absolutely priceless. She looks back at him and she gives him the once over and she says, "I don't recognize you. Which one of my sister's children are you? In other words, I've been appointed to this post by a man that's incredibly superior to you, professionally, intellectually, socially, however you want to slice or dice it. I have every right to be here, and I'm not going to sit here and take any of your blowback simply because your expectation is that someone that looks like me ought not to be going into that building, ought not to have this job, ought not to be doing what I'm doing. It is a very, very vivid example with respect to racist expectations in this society. So, in the next installment, we're going to move Richard Wright north. You're going to hear about, or you're going to learn about his move to Chicago and this perceived freedom that he thinks that he's moving into in the north, only to find out that a much more subtle version of racism exists up there as well. And you'll see what I mean when we come back.